Hey guys, welcome back to another Dragonheir Silent Gods video. In today's video I'm going to be talking to you about in my opinion, the best epics in Dragonheir Season 3. This does relate to all seasons, but obviously some of the heroes I am going to be mentioning are exclusive to Season 3 onwards. Before I get into that though, I just want to say a huge thank you to Dragonheir Silent Gods for sponsoring this video. If you are interested in giving the game a try, please do click the link in the description and get involved today. So, in terms of the heroes that I think are the best epics in the game, the reason I'm doing this video is towards the end of this month, there was meant to be the epic chest coming back for $1. And by the looks of it, that has been pushed back to around the middle of May as part of the kind of half anniversary event for Dragonheir. Obviously, the developers are currently going through a little bit of a difficult time due to the fact that the company has been taken over by another company, so it's a little bit of upheaval for them at the moment. So I think they've probably had a little bit of issues with development and kind of having the right team to work on certain things, so they've had to be a little bit careful and push the event back by what I'm assuming is going to be a couple of weeks. There's no specific date announced yet. It was meant to be the 30th of April, but the word we're hearing at the moment is it's going to be kind of middle of May instead. So with that in mind, with the box coming soon, I'm going to run through, in my opinion, the best epics in the game. I'm going to go through each different type and element and talk about where they're useful. There are going to be some that are kind of a little bit more niche than others. However, if you're in the position where you're kind of looking to build out teams and you're missing some of these key epics that I mentioned, they may be a really good option for you to pick up from that chest if you are going to buy it when it does come. However, if you're in Season 1, I know that you do have this chest available anyway for $1, so it could be a really good starting point for you, or just a really good way of filling in the gaps in your roster for you. So, first of all, we're going to run through all of the damage types. In fact, no, we'll start with the tanks first. I'll come back to the supports at the end. But in terms of tanks, this has been the same answer for Season 1, 2, and now 3. The answers are very clear, and it's Throwabath first of all. So Throwabath is from the poison element. So in Season 1, Poison was paired with Fire. Season 2, it was paired with Lightning, I believe. And then Season 3, now it's paired with Ice. Throughout all of that, Throwabath remained an incredibly strong tank and healer. So on his passive battle skill here, he generates a healing nexus around himself for 6 seconds. And he heals based on his defense. So what you want to do is ramp up his defense really high, stack your team in a circle around him, and he's going to provide you a huge amount of healing. Which is incredibly strong in places like Vortex, where you're able to get everybody on top of Throwabath with no real negatives. On top of that, though, he does also bring an attack penalty AoE for on his ultimate skill. So that's a really good way of making sure you're keeping a good uptime on attack penalty and timing it perfectly to make sure it's covering the skills you care about. Next up, we've got the Radiance tank, Garius. So Garius is... well, realistically, Garius is an amazing tank. He's even better if you've got the legendary artifact, the Gatekeeper Staff. But realistically, that artifact is like an exclusive artifact for Garius. It is so strong. So just to explain why, first of all, on his passive skill, he has a chance to stack defense up to, or 2% up to, I don't know how many times it can stack. I think it stacks 20. Yeah, okay. So it stacks up to 20 times. So eventually he can get an extra 40% defense, which is really important because on his ultimate skill, he dispels all debuffs from himself and heals all allies by 600% of his defense. So this heal is absolutely huge, especially if you can stack him up with a load of defense, and then paired with the legendary artifact, any overhealing is converted into a shield, which, as you can imagine, if he's healing for tens of thousands, potentially hundreds of thousands in the right setup, you're getting a massive shield on your whole team. Garius, like that, is capable of keeping a whole team alive in a lot of situations for either the entire fight or for a very long time. You don't really need anybody else to support with him. However, paired with the Season 2 legendary from the second month event, Ardreth, it is even better because Ardreth boosts the healing received by the rest of your team on her ultimate skill. So that is why Garius remains probably one of the most important picks from these chests. So next up, we're going to go through the damage types, starting with Wild. For Wild, there's really one key option, and that is Tonnonen. So if you're building a Wild team, whether it be one with Flora or without Flora, Tonnonen is likely going to fit into your team. So baseline, incredibly strong single target damage, and stacks a huge amount of crit damage on passive skill. as well as getting 20% extra crit by baseline, so you only need to build 80%. But this ultimate skill hits 5 times and does an incredible amount of damage. So the 5 hitter is really good with Flora, because every time you're triggering wild, you are triggering Flora's passive. And also Tononon can wear Witch's Remains, the artifact, due to the fact that he hits so many times. It's a really good chance of landing that. So Tononon is an amazing pick for all situations for a wild team. Next up, we're going to go to Frost, and there is 2 that I want to call out in Frost. So first of all is Rava. Rava is one of the best Frost enablers. So Rava places Frost debuffs on people constantly. So battle skill places Frost, the ultimate skill places Frost in an AoE radius, also making Rava really good for Witch's Remains. On the passive skill, Rava gains more attack for each enemy under Frost as well, so can do some good damage. So yeah, if you're running a Frost DPS, like let's say for example Oster, Hivatar, even Dristo Erden and Usha, the rare, they're really good options to run with Rava, because he's just going to enable that damage. Next up, we've got one who I've not personally used. I saw it at the end of last season. That is Vidamir. So Vidamir has some really funky patterns with his damage, as you can see a cross there on the battle skill and a bouncing orb on the ultimate. However, the most exciting thing about Vidamir is he is effectively a Frost Sigrid. So when an enemy inflicted with Frost dies, he gains 25% attack up and recharges his ultimate energy. So in fights like Goblin, or AoE fights like, for example, the endgame boss of last season, or Season 2, the Mecha Talk, it was triggering this passive so often that you'd be able to get 2 to 3 ultimates from Vidamir every single rotation, resulting in a huge amount of damage. So Vidamir is really cool. I'm definitely going to use him this season if there's a kind of situation that arises where I can get away with a huge AoE damage dealer. I don't know what the end boss is going to be like, but if not, in a future season I will most definitely be using Vidamir. Next up, we've got Dauntless. So there's a few strong contenders in Dauntless. Shagroll does some really good damage and brings an attack speed aura, which is really good for Dauntless. Nimbus hits so many times on his ultimate skill, so really good for Witch's Remains as a kind of a supporting damage dealer, but also really good for legendary hero Evelios. So Evelios triggers his passive every time somebody hits, well, has a chance to. And because Nimbus is hitting so frequently, it's really good for triggering Evelios' damage to get more out of your team. But the one I want to call out here is Shoutar. So Shoutar is kind of a main damage dealer for Dauntless. If you don't have any of the legendary options, Shoutar is the go-to. So Shoutar does derivative damage based, well, whenever allies launch basic attacks. So this, built with a huge amount of enlightenment and attack, can deal huge damage. You just want to make sure you've got some fast hitting Dauntless heroes alongside you, just like Shagroll and Nimbus. They complement Shoutar really well, but Shoutar overall does a huge amount of damage from building him correctly in the right setup. Next up, we've got Rally. So the one I'm going to call out in Rally is somebody I've used every season, and that is Tathlin. So if you don't have a good enabler for your Rally team, for example, Lauren Thiel, the legendary, you aren't going to be getting the full potential of your Rally damage dealers, and that's where Tathlin comes in. So Tathlin is able to provide Rally buffs for one of your allies really frequently to make sure you've got Rally buff up for your ultimate skills. But on top of that, he does also hit multiple times, making him really good for Witch's Remains, the artifact for placing defense penalty. He also gives attack up to all Rally allies for 10 seconds on his ultimate skill, if he has Rally when he casts his ultimate. So he's just a really good enabler and a perfect addition to a Rally team. So I've got Huberg, and before getting Huberg, I didn't really use Rally very often. But as soon as I did, I built Tathlin, I booked Tathlin, and Tathlin was the perfect addition to that team, and it allowed me to do a huge amount of damage with Rally. Next up, we've got summons. So summons are a little bit awkward. There's actually 2 epics that I've used every season so far for damage, and that is because I don't have any of the legendaries other than one, and realistically they don't do a huge amount of damage. But Zadok and Joyce have proved to be incredibly strong in every rotation, well, every season for me, in the Continental bosses and the Chaos Shadows at the end of the season. So Zadok does a huge amount of damage and gains even more damage when an allied summoned unit dies. So it's really important to use somebody who can summon alongside him. But the damage he does in a 3-lane direction is incredibly strong and builds up over time, amounting in a massive amount of damage. Almost certainly going to top your meters if you're using Zadok. So next up we've got Joyce. So Joyce is a bit of a strange one because his ultimate skill doesn't do any damage. Instead it summons a copy of himself. He can have up to 3 at the same time. And he's just going to spam his battle skill and deal basic damage with those clones. As long as you can keep 3 of them alive, Joyce does do a lot of damage and becomes a really strong option. So you just want to be a bit careful with your placements of those clones because otherwise they can die very easily. So yeah, Joyce and Zadok I've used every single season for Chaos Shadows and Continental Challenges for Necrosis, and they haven't let me down yet. I have got the top rewards each time. Next up, we've got Poison, and really there's only one I want to call out here, and that is Corrin. So if you've got a heavy poison-based team, realistically revolving around legendaries, Corrin is really good for extending those poisons and applying poisons as well. So building Corrin with the Hourglass artifact and a ton of skill haste is, well, it's really key to those teams. But outside of that, if you don't have those legendary options, such as Lothair, Durango, Twitch, you're not going to realistically use poison in general. So Corrin there does lose a little bit of value, but if you have the right team, Corrin can be really good for you. Next up, we've got Corrosion. So for Corrosion, I'm going to call out Dargo, the new epic. Dargo is an incredibly strong hero who does a load of damage and becomes a really good Corrosion, well, a member of your Corrosion team, especially if you've got Whisk and Rook, for example. The amount of Corrosion those two can put out for your Rook to do a huge amount of damage is insane. I don't have Rook, but I will be using Whisk with my Dargo. And probably Sabrina the rare as well, who does a surprising amount of damage. So yeah, as you can see, 400% attack to the enemy with currently the highest Corrosion and converts 50% of the damage to Corrosion. On the ultimate skill, it hits 5 times as well, so it's really good on single target for Witch's Remains. However, I recommend you do actually build your Dargo for damage instead of with accuracy for Witch's Remains, and have that on somebody else instead, because if you build Dargo for damage, you are going to get a really high amount of Corrosion eventually and deal a good amount of damage. So next up we have got, what have we got next? Shadow. So Shadow is a no-brainer. So Taudi is an insane enabler for Shadow teams. If you're using Taudi with any other Shadow teams, like for example Ozil is who I use her with, she can keep him in his demon form permanently, as well as keeping nearly 100% uptime on defense penalty. If you use her with Espouta, the other legendary, you can have 100% uptime on defense penalty. So it is really strong. As you can see here on the passive skill, when gaining Shadow Energy, grants 30% of the attained energy to another Shadow ally. And then on the battle skill, she charges her Shadow Energy 3 times for 15 each time. So 30% of that goes to another ally. And then on the ultimate skill, she also grants all Shadow allies 5 Shadow Energy. So she is really strong as enabling and keeping your Shadow Energy full as much as possible, and definitely worth using if you're building a Shadow team. Next up we've got Aura, and Aura's a little bit underwhelming here because the best epic was just nerfed. So I run Aura quite frequently. However, despite the nerf, Theohine is capable of keeping up with Linkos, the legendary. So I've got them both fully booked. So the reason for the nerf is this skill here. Those two 10% upgrades used to be 100% upgrades on damage, so the battle skill did a lot of damage. But all in all, I mean, Theohine's just an AoE damage dealer for Aura who can do a good job, but it's just not what it was. She does kind of, I guess, reasonable amounts of damage. So yeah, she can do a job for you if you're kind of looking to fill a spot in an Aura team. However, if you don't have the exclusive legendary, I think Aura is a little bit underwhelming this season and maybe not worth using or wasting your resources on. Next up we've got Thunderbolt, and the same kind of applies there. I'm not a huge fan of Thunderbolt. I think if you have Pacunte and one of the 2 legendaries alongside Pacunte, then Manda can be a good option for placing Thunderbolt. However, it's really not worth using unless you've got those legendaries to pair with her. Next up we've got Ice Blast, and there's 2 in Ice Blast that I really want to call out. First of all, we've got the insane damage dealer, Girthin. So Girthin is a mini Beldel who does a huge amount of single target damage. You only need to build her with an 80% crit rate because her battle skill, which she's spamming here, does increase her crit rate by 20%. So she is really strong. If you build her out in a huge amount of damage gear with 80% crit rate, she will be carrying you. However, alongside her, you do want to have a Ice Blast enabler, and that comes to the next person, and that is Bledin. So Bledin is the best non-legendary enabler. So on his passive skill, as you can see here, whenever his skill triggers a critical hit, there's a 20% chance of granting 1 stack of Ice Crystal to 1 Ice Blast ally. On his battle skill, he gains an extra 20% chance of triggering a crit, but also deals damage. And on his ultimate skill, he grants 20% attack up for 10 seconds and 2 stacks of Ice Crystals to the hero and the Ice Blast ally with the highest attack. Then hits 3 times, making him a great contender for Witch's Remains, with an additional 20% chance of triggering a critical hit. So Bledin is really strong for enabling your, for example, your Girthin or your Beldel if you're lucky enough to have her. He is probably he's only second best to Shinna. So Shinna is kind of a better enabler than him, but he is absolutely insane for the job. And if you don't have Shinna, then he is one of your most wanted heroes as long as you've got some of those Ice Blast damage dealers. So next up we have got Burn. So for Burn, there's only one I'm going to call out, and that is Arassi's. And really, he's not that great. He's kind of like a mini Ashetius, the exclusive legendary, in the fact that he will explode and will detonate to all of the burn debuffs that are out. So as long as you're able to stack a large amount of burns, then he can deal some good damage. But it's nothing in comparison to what Ashetius does. But either way, it can work. He can do some good damage. You just need some very strong gear and very strong supporting cast around him to really get full value. So now we are on to the supports, and for the supports I'm going to do it by element because there's so many different supports worth talking about. So first of all, I'm going to call out 2 who are very, well, in fact 3 who are very good currently due to the way the bosses are working, and also generally for dungeons. So Dane, first of all, and the reason for calling out Dane is the fact that his ultimate skill has a chance to dispel 2 buffs from the enemies within range, and then does place attack penalty as well. Following on from that, if you look at Fyra, so Fyra places buff prohibition on his battle skill and then removes 2 buffs as well from his ultimate skill. And lastly, we've got Liko here. So Liko places buff prohibition. If the enemy has any buffs as well, she has a 100% chance of stealing 1 or dispelling 1 buff from the target. The reason for those 3 being mentioned by me is the Chaos Shadow boss that you'll be facing with Radiance and Fire both require buff dispellers. So having these options is incredibly strong. As well as that, they are great for Ancient Battlefield, which funnily enough, one of the Chaos Shadow bosses replicates. So if you need somebody to deal with those buffs, or in Grave of Curse, then these 3 epics are really strong contenders for you to slot into your team and help you clear that content. Next up, we've got Adolphus. So Adolphus is an incredibly strong shield support hero. So all of his shields scale from Enlightenment. So as you can see here, 15% targets max HP and 3,150% Enlightenment shields all allies. On his battle skill as well, he does place a single target shield and fills ultimate energy. But the best bit about him is when he shields somebody who already has a shield, he will additionally heal them for 75% of the shield granted. So the shields that he's able to put out are absolutely huge. I think possibly some of the biggest shields in the game outside of Garius with the staff. I used Adolphus a lot in Season 1 and Season 2. I haven't yet used him in Season 3, but I'm sure I will towards the end when we start to build out those kind of 15 teams for the Chaos Shadow bosses. Adolphus is almost certainly going to get into that. So next up we've got the Frost element, and there's only one I'm going to call out here, and that is Varesh. So Varesh is incredibly strong with the ultimate skill that dispels battle skill, that dispels buffs. But the ultimate skill is the most important thing here. So attacks all enemies on the board 3 times with a 75% chance of inflicting buff prohibition. So Varesh hits everybody, no matter where they are, 3 times, making her great for defense penalty through Witch's Remains, and also an amazing enabling Sigrid. And this season they are finally paired together, so you can use your Sigrid with a Varesh and make sure you're triggering the AoE hit from Sigrid on all targets. But outside of that, Varesh remains a great option for Grave of Curse, Ancient Battlefield, the Chaos Shadow bosses as well. But as well as that, sorry, just to mention as well, whenever Varesh hits a enemy, Well, every time he deals or she deals damage, she heals the ally with the lowest current HP by 70% of her attack. So as long as you build your Varesh with a large amount of attack and a large amount of accuracy, your Varesh is going to be absolutely dominating, placing debuffs everywhere and also healing your team while dealing a good amount of damage. So next up, we've got Necrosis, and there's two I'm going to kind of mention, and that is Questa and Curza. So these are both heroes who are supports, but they are very good at kind of acting as an off tank. So in Chaos Shadows, when you're building out all your teams and you need somebody to tank, both of these two provide attack penalty, but they also provide a large amount of support for themselves. They can be built quite tanky, and also they can deal a good amount of damage single target as well. So it's just a way of making sure your team has a tank, but also squeezing out some extra damage. Questa is also really annoying in the arena. Jumps to the lowest target enemy and ally if you're against her, and hits them incredibly hard. So Questa is all around just a really good epic hero. Next up, I'm going to mention Thea. So Thea is really good at debuff control. So on her ultimate skill here, she grants invisibility and debuff immunity to all ranged allies for 10 seconds. And as you can see there, the cooldown on that is 16 seconds, and that's before any skill haste. So you can actually get this cooldown quite low. She's really good at countering things like Sigrid in the arena to block debuffs going on you. But all in all, if you're looking to deal with debuffs in places like Grave of Rot, then Thea is a really good option for you and definitely worth investing in. Next up, we have Zaloth. So Zaloth, similar to Varesh, does a lot of healing based on attack. So if we look here on the ultimate skill, summons a prism at the designated location for 5 seconds, dealing damage to all enemies within range every 1 second, inflicting fear, but also heals all allies by 30% of the attack. In the meantime, every time it ticks, each enemy hit by this skill increases the healing by 15%. So Zaloth is capable of doing some really good damage as a kind of a supporting role, but also helps to keep you alive and can help to slow bosses down with recharging speed penalty, or control your enemies with fear or silence. So Zaloth is a really strong epic and one I've used religiously through Season 1, 2, and I will be using in Season 3. I haven't yet. But yeah, all in all, Zaloth is a great pick. Next up, we've got the Radiance element, and there's one I'm going to call out here, and that is Catherine. So Catherine is relatively weak as a healer, but as a debuff controller, she is really strong. So on her ultimate skill, she heals all allies within range by 10% of their max HP and 2,500% enlightenment, and grants debuff immunity for 10 seconds. So this is going to help you to deal with places like Grave of Rot, where you're taking a large amount of debuffs. Having somebody like Catherine to completely block those debuffs is really strong, and it can be really useful for things like Vortex as well, to avoid the defense penalty on stage 4, and various other places like Meander, where you're dealing with a lot of debuffs on the bosses. She is a really strong option there. As I say, her healing isn't the best, but she can just about get you through. But it's all about the debuff immunity. She's really good for that. Next up, we've got Lightning Element, and the one I'm going to mention here, I'm going to mention two, is Yola first of all. So Yola's kind of a control bot. She does a large amount of control. So when attacking enemies under silence, there's a 40% chance of turning that silence into a stun, which fits perfectly with her ultimate skill, which hits all enemies within a range by 3 times. Each with a 50% chance of inflicting silence for 5 seconds, and also inflicts attack penalty. And then on her battle skill as well, she also has a chance to inflict silence. And obviously every time she's hitting these targets that she's placed silence on, she has a chance to turn that into a stun. So Yola is really good at keeping your enemies locked out, and also really good at placing Witch's Remains as well, due to the triple hitting ultimate skill. Next up, we've got Nathaniel. So Lightning and Necrosis this season, it's quite limited for healers. However, Nathaniel is relatively good, just like Dauntless, kind of comes in as a really strong shielder. So on his ultimate skill, he grants 10% targets max HP and 1800 enlightenment shields, and defense up 1 to all allies for 10 seconds. Each enemy hit by the skill increases the shield value by 10% as well, so really good against AoE fights. But also on his battle skill, he dispels 1 debuff from allies within range and grants them 1 stack of recovery over time. So he's also going to do some healing as well. So I'm actually using Nathaniel in my Chaos Shadow team. I'm also using him in Pillar of Trials for my Necrosis Lightning team, and he is definitely doing a good job. He's not the strongest healer, that's for sure, but the shields he puts out are enough to get me by, and I'm sure he will kind of see it through till the end of the season in my teams. Next up then, the final thing is poison. So for poison, I'm only going to mention one, and that is Vikuk. So Vikuk is, once again, just like Catherine, really strong at dealing with debuffs. So on his ultimate skill, he heals all allies and dispels 2 debuffs from them. For each debuff dispelled, the healing is increased by 25%. But I will be honest, his healing is pretty low, so it only scales from max HP. There's no enlightenment bonus there, or attack bonus as some other healers get. So it is simply just a raw 15% HP, so it doesn't do a large amount. He's not going to be kind of your solo healer, but he can help to keep on top of things, and obviously the most important thing, he's a map-wide dispeller. So unless you've got kind of your inundated with legendary options, there's not that many AoE dispellers in the game, especially that can dispel more than 1 debuff. Even some of the legendaries like Jillian, for example, her ultimate skill only dispels 1 debuff. So having somebody who can come in and dispel 2 debuffs from each ally at the same time is really strong. Especially in places, once again, like Grave of Rot, and also in Famiander. But the other thing about Vikuk is on his battle skill, he does also inflict attack penalty for 5 seconds on a 10-second cooldown. So you're going to be able to get some good uptime from that as long as you build him with enough accuracy. And paired with somebody who actually does it on his their ultimate skill, like for example Furobath in the same element, you can maintain a really strong uptime of attack penalty for your team. So those are all of the epics that I'm going to go through today. Obviously, there are some others who are really good and kind of present themselves as quite strong in niche situations, especially when we're building out so many teams towards the end of the season. But I'd love to hear what you guys think as well. So let me know in the comments if there's any epics you think I've missed out, any you don't agree on. But yeah, I'd love to hear what you guys think as well. So that is all for this video. I do just want to say once again a huge thank you to Dragonheir Silent Gods for sponsoring this video. If you are enjoying the look of the game, please do remember to click the link in the description or the pinned comment and get involved today. But other than that, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.